So next I want to explain some of the applications of standard theory. I'd like to go ahead and just kind of just present and sort of show what standard theory is part of in terms of the bigger picture. So standard theory falls under the umbrella of a study called standard psychology. That's sort of the big picture version of it. And under this whole umbrella, we have a couple different iterations. First one, we have a standard theory. Which is the standard theory of psychology. And that essentially is just what gives us the behavioral index. That's kind of what we're dealing with. In standard theory, that's just giving us all of our rules. That's kind of the primary kind of thing. That's kind of like the introduction to standard psychology. It's like putting down all the ground rules. And then from there, what we're wanting to do is see what we can do with those rules. See what patterns emerge and what kind of things we can do with them. So after standard theory, we have something called STEM psychology. And STEM psychology is short for super social and, excuse me, STEM, I don't know where that came from, but STEM psychology is short for scientifically and statistically transmutable supersocial and metaphysical psychology. So to abbreviate all that, we just say STEM psychology. And STEM psychology is what I want to talk about next. It's just the trends that happen when you look at standard theory. And it allows us to look at things like personality. I think I mentioned the S value allows us to calculate that. And allows us to look at things like emotions and those kinds of different trends. And they're all basically done in a very similar way. It allows us to quantify a bunch of stuff. It allows us to look at how bad, kind of reiterate the definitions of the severity of a problem using something called the magnitude of derangement. It kind of lets us count up to how many cycles of communication are abnormal and then try to intervene based on that. So that's kind of the next step after that. But if you continue with doing that, eventually you're going to need a better way to keep track of each cycle of communication. You're going to want to start making maybe calculations or building models of that. And from there you have to kind of parallel mathematics into that, and that brings us something called metric psychology. So our STEM psychology gives us kind of like an interval to work on. We should have an interval between most of those phenomenologies. With metric psychology, we have to think about the magnitude of each individual unit. So if you remember back to the original explanation of standard theory, when we went through the components of impulse, we talked about there being like a magnitude of impulse being like 1/2, and then the magnitude of subtraction being like 3/2, and then we talked about the magnitude of compression being -1/2, and then we talked about characteristic being 3 units of information. Second, an additional characteristic on that being 6 units of information. We're essentially doing that throughout the entire behavioral index in metric psychology, but we're trying to figure out how we can use mathematical identities to solve that. And we can essentially address everything that we need to in the standard and non-standard version of the behavioral index using just a few mathematical terms. And this kind of equation, which is something like this. You just need this along with a factor of 2. And we can explain everything that we need to in standard theory and in STEM psychology, and then we can start applying math to it, like functions and anything you can do at that point with the natural numbers like e and I and pi, and anything you can do with group theory, and all that kind of stuff, you can start applying to people's thought processes if you just think of them as mathematical kind of identities. So that's what metric psychology is about, is applying all the different aspects of the behavioral index and using math to sort of explain that. So sometimes you have pi, sometimes you have pi over 2. And we can also use the complex unit circle, and we can look at something called a angle derangement. We can look at complex intersection, and we can look at complex rotation. We can do a bunch of really cool stuff in terms of thinking of anything that's abnormal. And we can also use that unit circle to define what a normal cycle of communication looks like in a mathematical sense, or mathematical sense. But once we have all those rules, all the way up to the point of a mathematical kind of thing, then from there we can start making models, and we can start predicting things. We can look at things over the lifespan. We can look at certain amounts of time. We can look at how much information is being processed by people. We can see how efficient they are. We can see, we can model like populations of people. We can predict things like voting and politics. We can see if laws are applicable. We can kind of justify certain laws. We can say, well, this law is kind of harming these people while it's helping these people. And we can just make big models of stuff, which is another goal that people do in psychology now. We have all that, and that whole study is called executive psychology. And if we use all these together, we end up with standard psychology. And that's looking at everything about what people go through based on one unit. And if we follow that unit, we end up being able to do all this other stuff. So what I want to move into now, we've kind of gone through most of what we need to in standard theory, from the introduction to kind of explanation of the standard and non-standard, and then a couple of things in between there, kind of bridging the gap between what's already been done in psychology, the diagnosing, the neurochemistry, all the different schools of thought, and sort of see what happens when we kind of look at some of the more general stuff. And I consider that to be some of the fun stuff in psychology, like people's personalities, and kind of the evaluating their intelligence and looking at emotions and that kind of thing. And that's what we're able to do in STEM psychology. And the only reason we need to go into metric or executive psychology is if you really have a purposeful application of it. Otherwise, it's not really that. I mean, there's not really much reason to go beyond either standard or STEM psychology in a practical sense. But if you're doing some kind of project, or you have some kind of really important application, or if you just want to kind of have things kind of boil down to a very kind of deterministic kind of set of models and things, then you can use metric and executive psychology. But the only thing I really want to talk about is STEM psychology, and that sort of will kind of let us advance beyond just standard theory behavioral index. We can start talking about the trends and the intervals and that kind of thing. So all these collectively are part of the whole study of standard psychology, which is kind of what I'm kind of putting forth and presenting in the videos and so on. But I'm starting at standard theory. Now I'll move to STEM psychology, and if anyone has interest in these, then that's something that honestly probably figure out. If you understand these very well, it's fairly easy to figure those things out and to see how we can use them, and this just becomes more and more tools to put in the toolbox. So moving on, we'll just go into STEM psychology and 2 or 3 of the main ideas that we see using this sets of tools. So now that we've talked about the other theories, and now that we've talked about the other diagnostic criteria, I want to talk about a couple of things that standard theory is able to do when it comes to viewing the trends of those other kind of things. And the first one I want to bring up is going to be the effect of medications. I know that I mentioned that a couple times, but we can kind of prove that with the effects of drugs, and we can look at alcohol as well. And essentially what we're looking at is how those may influence the behavioral index, and hopefully it'll be kind of intuitive at this point. If you remember back to the non-standard version, we mentioned what happens when you alter the components of impulse. So if you change even one little thing about that normal ratio, then pretty much any other aspect of it can also become abnormal. And what we want to look at when it comes to medication, when it comes to drugs, we want to see how they influence the components of impulse, and then from there we want to see how they influence the different aspects of the behavioral index. So if you remember, the components of impulse are going to be a impulse, and then they're going to be a subtraction, and then a compression. And on the index, we use the Z0 scale to explain that. So we have impulse, we have subtraction, and then we have compression, where attention is put to the environment because something gives us the kind of amount of information that pulls us, kind of a stimulation that pulls our attention to the environment. And then during the subtraction, we compare what's happening using a copy of that information and what's already stored in the brain. And then from there, we choose whether or not to store that information, or whether that information is familiar enough to kind of leave as is. So what we look at whenever we introduce a medication into the equation is how they're going to influence these components of impulse. And the most obvious thing that's going to happen is the impulse is going to change. And medications can do one of a few things. One thing that you can do with the medication is increase the amount of impulse that's happening. The other thing a medication may be able to do is decrease the amount of impulse that's happening. And finally, the other thing that medications and different drugs can do are increase the rate at which impulse is experienced. So if you look into neuroscience, we know quite a bit about how long it takes the brain to do things. There's a funny kind of trick that you can do where you have an individual hold out their hand, hold out their arm, and you hold a $20 bill or kind of a banknote in front of them, and you drop it, and you have to have them catch the note before it passes through their fingers. And what that demonstrates is that there's some sort of delay between the time that the information from the environment is processed to the time that the hand actually closes around that thing. And that tells us that there's some limitation, or there's some amount, kind of maximum amount of impulse that a person should be able to use normally. And if that is the case, then we are kind of limited by how quickly we can do that. But using medications, we can increase that. It may not necessarily mean that we move faster, but we may be able to try to make sense of that information more quickly. And if that's the case, it can lead to other problems with compressing information. It can lead to problems with how much energy is available to do that, and those kinds of things. And when it comes to subtraction, if you induce all those additional impulses, or if you increase or decrease the impulse, that means that the amount of information that you're comparing can potentially change as well. And not only that, you have to have sufficient time. If you assume that there is some kind of physical limit to doing that, you have to have sufficient time to make that comparison, which potentially also limited by the brain, or part of the normal process of going through that delay. And if you have too many impulses, you may not make enough comparisons necessarily, and for that reason, you may not compress all that information. So that leads to a problem. And similarly, if you have impulse that's happening in the brain from like a drug or a medication, potentially you don't have any way to compare that to external stimuli. There's no external thing that's happening. So you end up with internal kind of subtraction. You're comparing what's already in there to whatever's already in there. Instead of comparing something from the environment to what's there, you're comparing some internalization to some internalization, and that leads to issues as well. And finally, compressing that information, meaning that when you go through the whole process of explaining or communicating what your experience is to somebody else, there's a chance that the other person has no idea what you're talking about, because there isn't any real environmental information going along with that. The only thing they're giving you the only thing that you're communicating with them at that point is some iteration of stimulation. It doesn't have anything to do with the environment. It doesn't have anything to do with something that other individual can necessarily confirm or something like that. It's just based on that internal stimulation that you have. So that leads to, you comparing your own internal stimulation to your own internal stimulation rather than obtaining information from the environment during that process. And that's sort of the issues that you have when it comes to components of impulse. And what you can also have are things that prevent the memory from being stored. You can have things that prevent the subtraction from being made, and you can have things that sort of dampen the impulse. So the whole point is that any kind of adulteration that you put into this system can change how you go about experiencing any of those processes. And fortunately, that means that when you get to intelligence, even if you have that medication in place or whatever, and you have all those problems going on, there's still a potential to obtain all those things you need for intelligence. It's just that once you get there, the compressions that you have to combine with one another become irregular. And from there you start combining irregular compression. And once you combine a bunch of irregular compressions and you hit the gap, you have to transmute all that stuff into the Z scale. And once you get to the Z scale, those are all unresolved. So you have to try to find some way to figure out some terminal iteration of those. And furthermore, that drug or medication, even if you get past the limit, can still be active in the brain at that point. And the easiest thing that will happen is that the continued stimulation will take up cycles of communication until you move out of the normal range. And then it can continue in the abnormal range, and then continue to the point where you lose out on these faculties to where the only thing that's causing any real meaningful activity in the brain is the continued stimulation of the drug or the continued stimulation of the medication. And because of that, you end up very quickly with everything being abnormal and everything being irregular. So if you choose to use if you choose to use a medication to manage a problem, or if you choose to self-medicate using a drug, you kind of have to think about how far from the normal it's going to take you. And what you want to aim to do is find a drug or a medication or something else that will allow you, even if it influences all this other stuff, but you want to find a medication or a drug that will allow you to stay in the normal range once you get to post-intelligence. And there are likely medications that do that. There are likely medications that kind of push you out of that range, and so on. But anytime you add one of those adulterants, that's kind of what you're doing, is potentially changing some aspect of the components of impulse. And if that's not the case, if the medication or drug that you're using somehow doesn't influence the components of impulse, which is kind of difficult to think that would happen, but if it doesn't influence the components of impulse, then there's also a chance that it replaces some other neurochemistry. And this probably isn't a good time to bring it up, but I know that I didn't mention in the video version the role of neurotransmitters in the R scale. And most of the neurochemistry that we see is going to be in the R scale. And if you have some kind of psychotropic medication or something like that that influences the way that those neurotransmitters are processed, then what you'll see is essentially the same kind of problem, is that the stimulation is going to take you out of normal range. You're not going to be able to compare the correct amount of information or to combine the correct amount of information, and then you're also not going to be able to compress those things. So there are only a couple of places that the neurochemistry is really important, and one of them is right here at the second characteristic. There's one at the sixth characteristic, and then there's one at the gap. And those are really the only places that the neurochemistry really comes into play. And it's not that hard to believe because there are only three or four excitatory neurochemicals. The only exception is going to be the vertical gap right here at -185, but those are going to be endocrine, physical, internal kind kind of things for the metabolism rather than from the brain. And anyway, anytime you have a psychotropic medication that influences these things, you're going to be changing the ranges of where those activities happen. And with alcohol, what you see is this range being extended. So with alcohol, you get from instead of 117 being the gap, you get from 118 to 122, and the gap happens between 121 and 122 at that point. And there are a few other consequences of that. You have to start, if you have an experience that that happens under the influence of alcohol. If you look into neurochemistry, alcohol influences the GABA receptors, and the GABA receptors are kind of the handbrake of the brain that kind of slows your brain down, and dumps a bunch of chlorine into the system, and prevents the brain. It kind of lowers the activity of the brain. So if you'd like to look into how that mechanism works, that's something that neurochemistry is discovered. That's kind of how it's explained. But the problem with using alcohol is that you experience things outside of the normal range. And what you have to do is think backwards from there. The same way the dark cycle in the dark scale, you have to kind of go backwards. And the same way with the energy saving thing, you kind of have to work in a more negative direction. That's kind of what you have to do, because normally whenever you have that amount of stimulation, or you have the activity of those things, your brain kind of slows itself down. But if you can induce that without having to overload your brain with that information, you can still have experiences that follow the same pattern of impulse, subtraction, and compression. The problem is when you go back to re-experience that, you have no way to stimulate yourself without stopping or slowing yourself down. So that whole use of alcohol can influence that. And the same with the release of dopamine. Normally, whenever people release dopamine, the whole purpose of doing that is to reverse the impulse, reverse the level of activity. The same way that in the Z-naught scale you have impulse, subtraction, compression. Whenever you get to the faculty of intelligence, the only thing you're doing is combining information. And eventually the level of energy, kind of level of activation associated with that combination becomes more than what the brain can kind of send back to itself. That it kind of reaches a critical point where it's too heavy to kind of resolve. And the thing that steps in to fix that problem is dopamine. And dopamine kind of takes that all that additional activation and kind of gets zapped and sort of reverses all of that information. And that's what leads to compression in the R scale. And I don't think that's been mentioned in the video version, but I think it is mentioned in the book version. So kind of a convenient place to bring that up. But if you have something that influences dopamine, then there's a chance that you're going to be either compressing information that has not happened yet, or you're going to be preventing that overload event from resolving itself, which leads to kind of some personality issues and that kind of thing. And then at the second characteristic, we really deal with all of the inhibitory molecules, and those are kind of what prevents the brain from moving beyond that. So if you have something like something that influences serotonin, which if you look into neurochemistry, that's one of the kind of primary ones. It's sort of an inverted version of a inhibitory molecule, because once that inhibitory molecule is removed from its place, once it's released, that means that the brain at that point is able to use all that extra energy to do all the things it needs to do. So if you have something that influences serotonin, there's a chance that it replaces serotonin, or it is not available when all the other inhibitory molecules are there. So, excuse me, if you do the same thing where you order things from the least complex to the most complex, you can kind of put serotonin a little bit higher on that list of the complex kind of things. And if that's kind of the terminal point, and for whatever reason it's not there, the brain will try to expend a bunch of energy that it technically does not have or should not have access to. and that leads to all kinds of other issues. And the other thing to mention is oxytocin, and that's kind of the whole thing about going through and activating libido and having it there. It's also related to touch, but doing that can also be influenced. Being able to do that can also be influenced by changing the neurochemistry at those points. And the other excitatory molecule is MSG, which is related to our appetite. But once again, the only reason that we use that is to release, is to get the serotonin released from there. So if you think of serotonin like as a lock, you have to do all that other stuff. You have to build all that other stuff up to be able to unlock that sort of release of serotonin, so that all the stuff can flow through the gate. And then the other excitatory molecules are from our adrenal glands and from the endocrine system, and that's sort of what determines our vertical gap. So anytime you use any kind of psychotropic medication, essentially what you're doing is forcing one of these processes to happen. And if they don't happen in a stepwise way, and they don't happen in a congruent way, and they don't happen in a way that can be resolved by what the brain has as its own disposal, when everything else is there in terms of its own sources of dopamine, its own sources of serotonin and so on. And also if there is lack of associated experience and information with it, it can lead to other issues such as that. And that is much more easy to think about when the substance, when the drug or the medication is no longer active. And you have some kind of disparity or some abnormal way of dealing with whatever the emergent kind of thing is as time goes on. So for all those reasons, it's very difficult to vouch or kind of support or advocate for the use of those psychotropic medications unless the brain is in a status where it can't do those things on its own. And normally there's something else that would cause that, whether it be some kind of injury or some kind of metabolic thing. But for the most part, you can consider several other factors that would be kind of intervention before you use a drug or medication. And I don't know if it's worth mentioning or not, but what happens very often is that people who prescribe medication and people who go into medical management, what they're doing is they're medicating the system. They're not medicating the individual, they're not working on the brain, they're working on the different systems that people are involved in. They're working on their family system, they're working on their job system, their relationship, they're addressing the social factor. And that's essentially giving them some way to deal with super social communication. So if you find yourself in a super social interaction and you try to describe something, you say, well, I'm on medication, or well, I've been diagnosed, or well this, or well that. But it doesn't change necessarily what the person's dealing with in terms of their arrangements. It doesn't necessarily resolve them very often when you get back down into the silent and other communication types. So many times the reason that people get the medication is just to medicate the system. It's for the sake of making a diagnosis, and it's for the sake of trying to intervene. But very often it leads to one of these other problems where the neurochemistry becomes affected, the influence of their own brain is kind of is interrupted, so that you view what they're going through based on that symptom that's caused by the medication rather than solving the actual fundamental problem. So those are all the places that standard theory recognizes the activity of excitatory neurotransmitters. So we have the endocrine neurotransmitter, which is really kind of part of the fight or flight response. That's what influences the vertical gap. We also have the GABA receptors, which are technically inhibitory. But we also have dopamine, oxytocin, and then all the other inhibitory molecules and serotonin. And those sort of give us a way to look at not only the neurochemistry, but why medications and drugs and stuff influence and affect those. And there's some different drugs you can think about, like cocaine, for example. If you study what has been done in cocaine, cocaine has aspects to its shape that influence both serotonin receptors and dopamine receptors. So you kind of zoom through all that without there actually being any relational or environmental experience, and you kind of just have an overload event continuously until you kind of wear yourself out. And if you have alcohol along with that, that kind of prevents you from hitting the gap. But eventually, you kind of tire yourself out, but the brain can't tell what's going on. And you end up kind of in a terminal point where the brain tries to shut itself down because there's too much stimulation. That's why cocaine can be very dangerous. Methamphetamine is also very similar. I think most of the things that are done on methamphetamine talk about how it releases dopamine, but that's seems to be one of those cases where it's just a correlation rather than a causal kind of thing. If you look at what methamphetamine does and how it affects people and the way they communicate, according to standard theory, there's really way more activity of methamphetamine at the second characteristic than it is in the sixth characteristic. It's just a kind of consequence of having that gate opened. That's kind of all that methamphetamine does in terms of what standard theory recognizes. It just removes that inhibition and allows people to communicate to the point where the amount of stimulation that's happening leads to a consequential release of dopamine. And there's also MDMA, or ecstasy, and that has aspects of serotonin and dopamine activity. And most people that I've seen study and talk about that, they also say that there's kind of some adrenal activity going on with it. But in all reality, that's part of, it's kind of a consequence of just having all that stimulation happen until the gap. So it's another kind of seemingly mistaken thing that standard theory sort of organizes differently. And that's just kind of a result of that overstimulation to the point where you hit the gap. So if you think of there being a kind of floodgate open at the second characteristic, and you kind of think of the continued stimulation of the sixth characteristic, and you kind of think about pushing yourself all the way through that, and that activity continually happening, that's one of those cases where the stimulation from that medication or drug pushes you all the way through the normal range, and that's kind of what seems to lead to the activity of that. So when it comes to STEM psychology, we're really looking at just a couple of things, and it's essentially just the trends that we see, and those trends are mostly going to be in the R scale, and we're going to see what happens when we identify those trends, we kind of define them, and we see how they may affect what happens when we get into post-intelligence, and see if there's something we can do to predict how much problem may occur based on how much resolution has happened, and based on these sort of trends that we're viewing in the R scale. And those trends are mostly defined by intervals, and each communication type has its own interval. And using that, we can sort of determine how a person can kind of be expected to see, how they can be expected to behave. And the thing that we're looking to see is whether or not we can view some ratio of resolution. And that allows us to define an interval based on all this stuff. And that's kind of based on each communication type's dynamic. And if you have the book version, the chapter has something like SQ, IQ, EQ, something like that. And unfortunately, many of those are already used for other purposes. So the other way you can think about them are just intervals. And essentially, we have a communication type, and then we have an interval to go along with it. So the first one is going to be silent. The silent interval. And the silent interval is going to be between the silent orientation, which is the third characteristic, and the self-interaction, which is the second characteristic. And if we think of this as a value, like a number of times that we resolve our silent interaction, and we think about this as a number of times we've actually gone through a silent interaction, you end up with something called the silent interval. And you can think about that as a distance between them. So if the second characteristic resolves itself, it results in a orientation. It results in the third characteristic of communication. And if we are able to observe people and we see that they do something but they do not obtain the orientation to something, that means that the interval is left unresolved, and that leads to a larger interval. And essentially what we're trying to see is how close we can get that interval to actually resolving itself and being a 1-to-1 ratio. So anything that's larger than that is going to be an unresolved process. We want that. We want for every time that we go through a self interaction, we want to be able to result that in an orientation. We want to understand why that self interaction happened. So we want to understand why we drink water and we feel less thirsty. We want to understand why we sleep and we feel more rested. And it may not be all the way to the point of like, you know, chemicals and molecules and stuff, but it's at least the point where you have a preemptive understanding of that behavior and its result. And that's kind of what gives us our silent interval. And a 1-to-1 ratio is essentially no interval. That means that they're equal to every time you do something to change your body status, you understand what's happening. And you can explain that to somebody, you can tell them what's going on, and that means you're oriented to that. And that's sort of what allows you to obtain the free will junction and to make those decisions, and it influences how well you're able to direct the energy that you do have available to you. And so if we measure the distance between those two, the difference between those, we end up with something called the silent interval. So all these are going to be intervals. In the book version, I think some of them are called quotients, but we can also use the term interval to kind of describe them. And then in intelligence, or in intimate communication, we define the interval in intimate communication as intelligence, total intelligence, because if we think about the other communication types in supersocial communication, we're grouping and sorting so that we can solve that problem either in orthogonal thinking, or we can solve it based on one-on-one and directly communicate what that relationship is with somebody else. So that's kind of like the terminal point of, kind of like the goal of going through all this stuff, is to get to the point where you can communicate those experiences one-on-one with someone. And when you do that, you're trying to look at the number of times that you get to that overload event, and you're trying to find the difference between the number of times that you interpret that event. And that is essentially what leads to the intelligence interval. And there's a lot of cool philosophical stuff you can think about there. I think in the book version there's something about obtaining a negative intelligence interval. But essentially, every time you have an overload event, you want to make sure that you not only understand that you've gone through the overload event, but you want to be able to interpret it as either positive or negative. And the more that you do that, the smaller that gap, the smaller that interval is going to become. And once again, we want a 1-to-1 interval every time that you go through a experience of the overload event. Then you also want to have an experience of resolving and interpreting what's going on there. And if you are able to do that, then you can think of that being sort of standard and resolved. But if you're not able to do that, then it's sort of abnormal, and that sort of widens the interval. It makes it different than a 1-to-1 ratio. And the thing that you can do is have some way to consider a multitude of experiences that may lead to an overload event that you may not have experienced yet, but you can still decide how you would feel if that were to happen to you, and if you were to go through that overload event, and try to determine the consequence of not only think of it as positive, but to think of it as negative. And in that way, you can kind of go beyond your own intelligence, and you can kind of think of situations you may find yourself in without them being completely unfamiliar to you. So having the smallest interval possible between there is kind of the most resolution, and then having a wider or any other interval between there is going to be a lack of resolution or preemptive resolution, which is also kind of considered abnormal. But there's also the intelligence interval. You can think of it as an intimate interval, but this I is intelligence interval. And that's kind of the true measure of how well somebody understands themselves. That's kind of, in terms of standard theory, that's how smart somebody is. Because people go through all kinds of different situations, but it's important to be able to recognize and interpret in situations that you find yourself in, which is one measure of IQ. But it's a little bit different because IQ tests some different things, but that's kind of, if standard theory did have an IQ, that's what it would be. But the IQ that people think about in terms of testing and all that stuff is somewhere in between silent interval, and the other one is something called the social interval, or I think in the book it's called the social quotient. And that's the difference between the number of items that you're aware of the number of kind of subsets of information, and the number of interpretations you have of that information, whether you recognize it or not, is a little bit different. And there are a couple other parameters you have to think of when it comes to social communication. But in the book version, there's a silent interval. So to kind of set that apart, that's usually kind of social quotient or social interval. But if you're breathing, if you're abbreviating it, you can use SQ for social quotient, but it's also just a social interval. So SQ or social interval. And essentially that is related to the number of things that are out there, because in reality there are only so many times you can make a subset of information before it, while still having it be meaningful. And then the number of times that you interpret those things are what leads to the interpretation of your social interval or social quotient. So it's just what you're aware of in the world, and whether or not you can demonstrate a recognition of those things. And in the traditional IQ testing, not only are you trying to figure out what you're aware of, you're also trying to combine that information and use it to solve a problem and so on. So the traditional IQ tests test several of these, but we can look at these individually and we can apply those to why a person may be going through something. We can try to figure out something about their silent communication and why it's not resolving. We can look at their intimate communication and why it may not be resolving. And then in social communication, we can figure out what they may be aware of or what they may not be aware of. But in shared communication, we have something called an emotional interval. And it's a little bit difficult to explain that without explaining emotion. And I think the book version of Standard Theory uses that sort of idea of an emotional quotient or the shared communication interval to explain what you should expect to see in emotion. But in order to do that, we have to describe what that interval would be. I'm not sure, anyway. The thing to do, though, is to explain what an emotion is. And that emotion is essentially what you're measuring. You're measuring essentially the experience of that emotion and then your resolution of that emotion. And the difference between those two things is referred to as an emotional quotient. And an emotion is defined by something called orthogonal impulse. And that's where you compare relationships. You compare the relationship you're in, and you consider a relationship that somebody else in, and you compare the result of those relationships. And the thing that happens as a result of that is the experience of an emotion. And it's referred to as orthogonal impulse. And it's essentially a complex composition of characteristics. And it's kind of an indirect way to compare your own status and your own set of relationships and your own circumstances with somebody else's status and relationships and their set of circumstances. And we can get pretty deep into emotion once we look a little bit more into STEM psychology. But essentially, you're getting some level of activation that you're experiencing and a result of that, and then a measure of some level of activation that somebody else is experiencing, the result of that, and you're comparing those comparisons. And what you end up with is a complex impulse. And that's sort of the term that describes the emotion, that process of a complex impulse describes what leads to the experience of an emotion. And people say there are hundreds and hundreds of emotions. If you really look into standard theory, there are a deterministic number of them. It's very close to, it's very easy to use complex communication to think about that. If you think back to complex communication, you have sort of the different levels and different factors, and then you have sort of the low energy version of it, you have the high energy version of it. And essentially what you're seeing is where you are, where you may be as an individual on the low energy or high energy side, and then you're thinking about where somebody else as an individual is on the high energy, low energy side, and you're making a comparison, and as a result of that comparison, what would otherwise be a one-on-one communication with that person, you end up experiencing kind of a culmination of that one-on-one experience, and that results in emotion. Sometimes it's happy, sometimes it's angry, sometimes it's sad, and so on. But that kind of explains what emotions are. And when we're looking at the interval in shared communication, what we're looking at is something called an emotional quotient, which is related to the experience of that emotion and then subsequently the behavior that is observed as a result of experiencing that emotion. So that whole process is referred to as the emotional quotient. I wish I had a better way to represent what the sort of emotional kind of things are. Unfortunately, I don't really have a good way to symbolize that, but if we just think of a complex composition, we can just think of some complexity plus some other complexity, and that will, this whole thing right here is essentially the process that defines our emotion. This is the orthogonal impulse, which is also a complex composition, but it's kind of an indirect comparison, some complexity that you're experiencing, and then some other perceived complexity that someone else is experiencing. You compare those complexities using the orthogonal impulse, and the result of that is an emotion. And then from that, we're thinking about that emotion that you experience, and we're thinking about where it lands you on the index. So let's say you get angry about something, and you kind of can't control yourself, you start behaving out of line. If we looked at how that applies to the z-scale, we would think that it's at least beyond the vertical gap. It's not going to be something that you can solve rationally necessarily, and it's not going to be something that's going to resolve itself without that behavioral kind of intervention. And if you think about how that applies to the R-scale, the whole aspect of behaving in intelligence is related to compensatory behavior. And if that compensatory behavior is continuously unresolved, then you're going to see that outburst or whatever in the z-scale at some range beyond normal. So that's kind of how we view the result of going through emotions and those kind of culminations of all those relationships and all those experiences. We can compare the relationships we have to the relationships that other people have, and we get some alternate experience from that. And that experience, in theory, applies to one of these characteristics. And the thing that becomes important is once we land somewhere on here, we end up in some range that will either result in a behavior or otherwise result in resolution. And what we want to have happen is an appropriate interval between the emotion that we experience and the behavior that we have. And once again, those are kind of complex because it depends on the emotion, and it depends on the circumstances, it depends on what people think are normal, and it depends on all kinds of stuff like that. So if you think about maybe experiencing the loss of a loved one, it would be really weird if you didn't have some kind of emotional response to that. But on the other hand, if somebody does something very insignificant, maybe they cough or something, and all of a sudden you just fly off the handle and start breaking things, that's kind of weird. That's kind of a very, maybe in the circumstance, maybe somebody had been kind of egging you on to the point where that cough just sends you over the edge. But anyway, you can think about those kinds of things in terms of what's appropriate in experiencing emotion versus the behavior that happens as a result of that. So anyway, that's kind of a little bit to kind of stuff into one spot, but that's what the emotional quotient is about. It's about experiencing an emotion and seeing how it influences your behavior and determining how well it resolves itself. So there are several things that go into that, and it goes along with experiencing the emotion. It goes along with the circumstances that lead to that emotion, and also relates to the behavior that you see in response to that. So the other one that we have that goes along with this is personality, and personality is technically part of the super social communication type. But to think about that, the primary thing that we think of is the dynamic of super social communication. And in super social communication, there's an interaction that happens the same way that we have the sort of comparison of these things and orthogonal thinking and in absolute thinking and super social communication. We have some interaction that's going on, And essentially what you can do is either apply a directive to that thing or deferral to that thing. And if you think back to the original explanation of the behavioral index and standard theory, we can think of the directive as being related to a positive interpretation of the situation. And then we can think of the deferral as being related to the negative interpretation of the situation. And at the supersocial interaction, what we see is what you can observe is either directive or deferral. And a person's tendency to display one of those other things, a directive or deferral, is going to define the personality type. So, the supersocial is going to be directive and compared to the deferral, and that's going to give you a personality type. And when we look at personality, what we're looking at is how a person tends to deal with the overload event and their interpretation of that thing. So if we think about standard theory and we think about how supersocial communication works, you're either working toward a rule at the supersocial orientation, but you're ignoring the pattern, and you're just looking at what the rule is that describes that pattern. And that's how you deal with things in a big group. But if you're looking at the individual, you're trying to sort out the information to figure out which one is more closely related to one another, and to see if there's a way that you can solve that problem using one of these other communication types, kind of a more direct way to solve that problem and to make that connection, that relationship. And the two things you can try to do is to actively try to get to the point where you're working one-on-one to solve that problem with someone, or you can try to actively avoid that problem. And the way that we go about doing that describes our personality. And in that way, we can look at 4 distinct personality types that sort of happen as a result of that. And we can look at that next. But these are the intervals that standard theory talks about. And this is how we can measure how well a person's resolution is thought to be. We can see how abnormal a person's sort of resolution seems to be. And it's silent communication. We have a silent interval, and that means it's close to one-to-one, meaning that every time we go through a self-interaction, we have a orientation to go along with it. And if it's anything beyond one-to-one, then there's some disparity. There's probably, you can consider a normal range of these, which is another kind of thing. But that's kind of what you want to look at, is how close to one-on-one ratio we have. And then in intimate communication, we have the intelligence interval, which is a culmination of the overload events that you have and the number of interpretations you have. And every time, the one-to-one ratio is every time you have an overload event, you understand the overload event happened, and then you have an interpretation, either positive or negative, of that event. And then in the social quotient, there are a couple other things to consider, but essentially you're looking at the subsets of information that exist within your awareness of the world. And the thing that you have to consider is that people have different awarenesses of the environment, the surrounding world. But within an appropriate subset, with an appropriate ratio of that, you want to figure out how well they're able to recognize whether or not they're familiar with the thing, either positive or negative kind of social interaction, as it were. Then in shared communication, we have the whole comparison of emotions between one another. And that whole thing is driven by the indirect comparison, and that's defined as an orthogonal impulse. And that impulse should lead to some characteristic or some kind of terminal point on the index. Wherever you are, it's going to get compressed. It's going to be pushed into the z-scale. And then you figure out whether or not that's in a normal range or not, whether it's well-defined or whether it's disproportionate or so on. And it takes a couple things to do, but that allows us to look at the thing we call an emotional quotient, which is your behavioral response to experiencing that indirect comparison. And then finally, we have a personality and supersocial communication, and that's basically a tendency to either work towards resolving a problem with someone or actively avoiding that problem with someone. So the next thing we can talk about is the different personality types. There are a couple of them, and that kind of will push us into that aspect of STEM psychology. So STEM psychology, lots of the stuff we deal with are like the trends, and as we mentioned a second ago, the intervals. And one of those trends, in combination with those intervals, that we can look at are personality types. And this allows us to look at a bunch of different things, and it's important to be able to understand all the other aspects of the index to be able to address some of the limitations that we deal with. And there's some aspects of metric psychology that go along with it, but there are several places where we're limited by physical factors, we're limited by kind of the ratios of what's going on, and the personality is kind of an indication of that. And there are 5 personality types, but standard theory recognizes them as 4 plus 1 personality types, and we'll kind of demonstrate that. And we'll just go ahead and list them, and then we'll talk about each one of them. So first we have positive personality. That's one personality type. And then we have negative personality. And then after that we have dissociatively positive. I'll just write D positive. And then we have dissociatively negative, which is D negative. And then we have depersonalization, which I'll just write as depersonality. And in each one of these types, they're essentially defined by the number of complexities. And if you remember back to the behavioral index, we define complexity as just some unknown, some unresolved cycle of communication, or some other factor that does not fit in well with what happens in a standard sense. And identifying that is just something you can do, whether it's a medication, whether it's a disorientation with a disruption or so on. But we think of them as complexities, and these are based on the number of complexities that we deal with. And in reality, there are only a certain number of complexities we can deal with and still make meaning of things. So positive, there are 0 complexities. There are 0 complexities in positive communication. And positive communication is essentially the tendency to divulge information and to express yourself in order to strengthen relationships with others. And you do that with the expectation that other people are going to communicate with you. You do that with the expectation that it's going to nurture and maintain the relationship. And you do that with the expectation to be accepted and to view other people doing that same thing with you. And there's not necessarily anything that is thought to stand in the way of it. There's no complexity to stand in the way of that. So if everything goes the way that it always should, and everything happens at the best, most optimal sense, that's what you expect people to display, is just expressing themselves. And the tendency to do that, and the preference to do that, and the sort of predisposition that leads to that is just thought of as a positive personality. And that means that regardless of who you're talking to, regardless of the situation, you're going to do your best to provide your own interpretation of what's happening to people in hopes that other people will respond to you. And that means that there's no complexity to it. That's just what the standard behavioral index leads to. It's kind of what the phenomenon that are organized on the behavioral index leads to happening. But that's kind of the sort of hallmark of what positive communication is about. It's just it's based on just divulging what you're going through to people and kind of trying to work toward the goal of having other people recognize what your experience is. So that's kind of referred to as a positive personality type. So there's no complexity involved in that. It's just best case scenario. That's what people will do. And then from there is a negative personality type, which has 1 complexity. And that personality type is essentially avoiding your communication of your experience based on some complexity. There's some reason why there's at least 1 complexity, or at least 1 reason behind why you don't want to express yourself to another individual. And there are several reasons why that happens, and there's at least 1 complexity that contributes to that. And there are things like being in a group, being a social kind of creature, as it were, being overcrowded, maybe you've gone through something that's traumatic, maybe you have a secret to keep, any number of things. But the tendency at that point is to withhold information from other people and to prevent actually sharing that information. And it's not that people who have negative personality types are trying to like avoid having a relationship with people or avoid that understanding. It just means that their understanding of the situation is going to be based on this complexity. And the whole thing is you don't tell that secret. The whole thing is you don't get that information across. The whole thing is that you withhold that for some other sake, for the sake of a relationship, for the sake of a circumstance. It could happen because of medication or whatever. But the tendency is to expect the communication to be unresolved. You expect it to be based on that one complexity, and you expect there to be some kind of secret or mystery that sort of defines what that relationship is about. And the whole sort of mindset behind that is if you resolve the relationship, you've kind of done with it. You know, that's kind of the end of the fun. But if you keep that complexity alive, or you keep that complexity around, then it prevents you from having to kind of just say, you know, it is what it is. It kind of prevents you from doing that. And it leads you to maintain the dynamic interaction of the relationship without having to resolve it, and then go through all the other work to try to get build up some other mystery or some other problem, and then resolve that, and so on. You kind of just perpetuate that unknown aspect of things. And if you hear positive personality versus negative personality, you may think that negative personality is bad, but it's not. You can have just as fulfilling relationships with people. You can be just as happy and experience all the things that you need. It's just that instead of the dynamic of the relationship being related to divulging yourself, you make the dynamic about controlling yourself, or sort of containing those feelings and those emotions and those need to make yourself known and all that stuff. You can kind of subdue that for the sake of the relationship and so on. So just because it's positive versus negative doesn't mean positive is good and negative is bad. It's just based on the complexities that people use and their tendency to actually get to the point of constructive intimacy. And some people actively kind of avoid it in negative personality and kind of dance around it. And in positive, you always try to make that constructive intimacy happen. So just circumstances, the complexity that are associated with negative communication kind of defines how that relationship is handled. And in positive communication, there is no complexity. It's just, that's the point where you're always going to divulge what's going on. And you're doing that in hopes of strengthening the relationship. And those are kind of the most simple cases. So, and a positive, dissociative personality type, this D here stands for dissociatively positive. And if you remember in the non-standard behavioral index, when you dissociate from somebody, when you dissociate from your own internalizations, you kind of remove the connection between them. You have in the dynamic of intelligence, you reactivate an experience, you activate another experience, and you make a connection between them. When you dissociate, you remove the connection between them. You still may have both of those things kind of actively in queue, as it were, but you may not make a direct connection between them right away. In positive communication, you're always making that connection. In negative, you're also always making that connection. It's just whether or not you divulge it. And in dissociatively positive, you actively remove that connection. You actively dissociate yourself from the situation, and then from there, you have to choose whether or not you're going to communicate with that person. And after you've decided whether or not you communicate with that person, then you kind of selectively use what information you have to facilitate that divulging of information. And those are the two complexities you see. One of those complexities is going to be dissociating first and trying to figure out what's happening when you're getting in a situation with somebody. And the second thing you see is going to be actually divulging what you're going through, based on the information that you have available. I think this, as an individual, I think this describes the way that I go about handling my relationships with people. I like to think of myself as a positive personality, but in all reality, I'm more of a dissociatively positive person. Even if I have information to give to the situation, there are many times where I'll kind of just step back and see if I need to intervene, or see if I need to say something, and if not, then I'll just go about my way. But if there's something I can do to help somebody or try to resolve the situation, then at that point I may step in. But if you had a positive personality, you would step in no matter what. If you had a negative personality, you would actively avoid that situation. With a dissociatively positive, you would kind of check out what the situation is first and then decide to kind of step in. So there's also dissociatively negative, which has 3 complexities. And the thing with dissociatively negative is not only already having a negative tendency, but dissociating from the situation and then finally trying to actively avoid getting involved in it. You know, so not only are you having the normal kind of negative tendency to avoid what's happening, once you realize that something may be happening, you remove yourself from that situation. And if for whatever reason you're pulled into that situation, or for whatever reason things get to the point where you have to get involved in it, then you're going to try to avoid divulging exactly what's going on. You're going to use other sources of information, or you're going to do something else to facilitate whatever the communication with that person is. And similarly, you're still willing to communicate at that point. You're still willing to try to become involved and kind of give your interpretation of what's going on. Kind of provide your 2 cents. But you have to go through all those other. It's kind of like worst case scenarios that finally they kind of pull you into it and you kind of are forced to get in. There are several steps where you try to get away from that. But if you are somehow pulled into that situation, then you'll still communicate with them, but it's going to be in a negative way. It's going to be after you've already pulled yourself out of that, and it's going to be a way that prevents you from actually divulging your true understanding, your true experience directly to them. And that's kind of what dissociatively negative is about. And then finally, we have the lack of personality, or the depersonalized personality type. And you can also think of it as a dissociative personality type, but in that sense, there is no individual interpretation. So if you look at the other personality types, this is all about how you go about approaching constructive intimacy. And in the depersonalized or lack of personality type, you do everything to avoid that. And the main way that you'll see people do it is to allude to the environment. So anytime that something lands on that person, they just allude to the environment. They don't give anything about what they know. They don't talk about who they are or why it's important to them. They immediately dissociate or depersonalize themselves. And the meaningfulness that leads to that becomes associated with that interaction is something environmental. It's pointing somewhere else and saying, something's happening over there, don't worry about me. And this is sort of the kind of similar, kind of something you can parallel to leading with a derangement. That's kind of what they're doing. And if you somehow get pulled into the process, you just point to some external thing and you replace that environmental thing with whatever they're prompting you for. So it's kind of lack of a personality. So that's kind of where we get the 4+1 personality types. But in general, these are the tendencies that you'll see with people. Is positive personality, where they're directly trying to get involved and strengthen relationships by divulging information. And then there's a negative personality types where they maintain their relationships by staying kind of a step behind or a step forward or a step to the side. And then we have dissociatively positive, meaning you kind of step back and then choose whether or not you're going to get involved. And if you do get involved, then it's positive. And then with negative, you kind of take a step back, figure out whether or not you're getting involved. And if you do get involved, it's going to be negative. And then finally, there's a lack of personality, meaning anytime you get involved, you just talk about the social environment. You don't talk anything about your personal experience. You don't talk about anything about who you are. You always talk about the social environment or somebody else's relationship or something over there or, anything that's not related to whatever the individual is going through. And that essentially defines the personality types that people have. And there are only 4 of them because there's you can kind of think about that as being related to the ratio of the way things happen. I'm not sure we've been able to really cover that in this video series, and I'm also not sure if it's expressly explained in the book version either, but it's more related to metric psychology than it is to anything else. But anyway, that gives us the definition of our personality types. Those are the kind of the 4+1 that we have. And that essentially gives us a way to look at the tendencies of people beyond just constructive and destructive behavior and communication, but how we can expect them to participate when they do have a tendency one way or the other. So there's something that I wanted to kind of take an aside and bring up, which is morality, and it's very similar to this, but morality is something that falls in line with this very, very similarly. But I will go ahead and take an aside and talk about the levels of morality, which are very closely related to this kind of idea that there's a ratio of things that we can experience, kind of a ratio of levels of things that we can go through. So just to run through these really quickly, this could also probably be its only video, but morality deals with essentially, for this purpose, morality deals with how you think about punishing other people, how you think about other people's consequences, and how you intervene in other people's lives based on that other person's actions or behavior. And essentially we have 4+1 types of morality. And the first type we have is amorality. And that means that you don't understand what consequence is. You don't understand that your actions influence people, and you may not understand behavior. You may have some kind of other limited kind of thing. You may have some kind of developmental delay or some kind of injury or some other kind of process, but you may not understand right from wrong. You may not understand good from bad, and you may not understand the consequences of your actions. And for that reason, you can't judge other people because you don't have your own understanding of good or bad, and that's kind of lack of morality or amorality. And the next level of morality is essentially called basic morality, and that's kind of like the tit for tat kind of morality, meaning that if you do something bad is supposed to happen to you, and then alternately, if you do something good should happen to you. That's kind of basic morality. That's tit for tat, kind of sort of like the idea of karma. But if you do something bad, then you get punished. If you do something good, then you get rewarded. That's basic morality. And then moving on, the next type is individual morality. And that's where you have to think about who is doing the thing. You say, well, sometimes good people do bad things. So you have to consider how good that person is versus how bad the thing they did. And based on that, you kind of determine what the actual consequence should be. And on the other side of things, you say, well, bad people sometimes do good things. And you have to figure out, how bad is that person? How much impact did that good thing provide for other people? And you have to determine the consequence based on that. But it's a case-by-case basis at that point. You have to figure out who that person is, what they've done, what the circumstances are, and then based on all that information, you decide if it's something that they should be rewarded for, and how much reward they should get, or if they should be punished, how much punishment they should get, if it's something that kind of isn't of consequence or whatever. But you have to consider all those things on a case-by-case basis, and that's kind of individual morality. And then beyond that, we have absolute morality. And absolute morality is not taking the individual into account. It's not really taking the circumstance into account. It's thinking about what has happened and getting that individual to a better place. That's essentially absolute morality. Whatever the situation is, whoever the victim is, whoever the perpetrator is, doesn't matter. We're going to get everybody to a better place. We're going to improve everybody's situation. That's kind of absolute morality. And the other way to think about it is it doesn't matter who the perpetrator is. It doesn't matter who the individual is. We're going to put them through a struggle so that they have their own individual triumph over their circumstance. But either way, what we're going to do is either make everybody's situation better, or for whatever reason, we're going to put everyone through a struggle or trial or tribulation. And it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter what happened. It just matters whether they're going to become a better person. And that's absolute morality. The only thing we're worried about is getting people better. Just get to a better spot, whether it be through struggle or whether it be through reward or whatever. Just get to a better place in your life. That's kind of absolute morality. And then finally, we have ultimate morality, which is based on authority. And ultimate morality can have any of these other aspects into it, but the person who decides is the person who has authority, and that's basically whatever I say goes, and nothing else matters. If I want to punish someone, I'm going to punish them because I said so, whatever factors. If I'm going to reward somebody or let them off the hook, I'm going to do that because I said so and I'm in charge. And the only thing that, even if it's even if it's mismatched or it's unbalanced or it's not exactly in line with one of these other ones, it's just the idea that the person has the authority to make that decision, and they exercise that authority in handing down that judgment. It's not necessarily to get them to a better place. It's not necessarily considering who they are. It's not necessarily right or wrong. It's just whatever I say goes. That's kind of ultimate morality. And then finally we have amorality again, meaning that you don't care what those people are going through. You don't care, it doesn't involve you. Even if it does, you're not going to deal with it. So it's kind of the other aspect of lack of morality, or in this case, kind of lack of interaction with the situation. And these are more closely related to the different communication types, but it follows the same pattern of kind of the ratio of things that we're able to do, kind of same ratio of memory and all those other things. And it gives us a way to think about how people expect to handle other people's situations. When you look beyond the individual, when you look beyond your own circumstance and you have to intervene in somebody else's circumstance, this gives us a way to expect how people are going to deal with them. And it gives us a really easy way to pinpoint how to think about why a person handed down that judgment or handed out that consequence. And it also gives us a very easy way to kind of audit or look back on what decisions people do make when they're put in these positions of authority, or when they're given the ability to make these decisions that influence other people's lives. So if we need to hold somebody accountable for someone, if you have some kind of a profession that answers to a licensing board or something like that, we can look at how you handled that situation in terms of handing out the consequence based on these types of morality. Same way we can look at your personality type. You can do that when you're doing it in a more consequential way when other people are involved. These personality types are kind of how you handle yourself as an individual, and these morality types is how you handle other people based on their actions. And sometimes it's based on being an individual, sometimes it's based on other factors, but that gives us the ways, kind of the different ways that we can punish people, and how that whole process of thinking about punishing them comes about. So you can think of these kind of the personality types, the standard version of dealing with our circumstances. And you can think of the morality types as the non-standard version of dealing with our circumstances, because we're doing it through another person. We're doing that through somebody else's action. So you're having to make a decision based on something that you may or may not have been involved in. But anyway, those are kind of the ways that we can trend how we explain the way we treat other people versus how we deal with our own participation in different events. So these give us our personality types and also levels of morality. And those are just some other things that we can do whenever we start looking at the trends and other things like that in sentence psychology.